Great. Good evening, everyone. I know people are still joining probably, but we'd like to get started. We're very pleased you've joined us this evening for this installment in our Book of Mormon Conversation series. My name is George Durham. I'm a board member of the John A. Widtsoe Foundation, which is really pleased to be partnering with the Neil A. Maxwell Institute tonight as part of this ongoing series to discuss insights tonight about Mormon and insights into Mormon in the Book of Mormon with my guest, Adam Miller. Adam has written a really fascinating, provocative, and also very accessible volume on Mormon for the Maxwell Institute series, the Book of Mormon, Brief Theological Introductions. And I look forward to our discussion with him this evening. I will get things started shortly, but we also do look forward to you all as an audience submitting and sharing your questions as well. You can do this using the Crowdcast tool. In the lower right-hand portion of your screen, you'll see a little text box that initially says, say something nice, but if you click on the plus sign, you'll see an option to ask a question, and we'll ask that you use that feature to ask questions, and the moderators will keep an eye on that throughout the evening. By way of a brief introduction, it pleases me to introduce Adam Miller to you all. Adam S. Miller is a professor of philosophy at Collin College in McKinney, Texas. He earned an undergraduate degree, a BA in comparative literature from Brigham Young University, and then an MA and a PhD in philosophy from Villanova University. Adam is the author of 9 books, including Speculative Grace, The Gospel According to David Foster Wallace, Letters to a Young Mormon, and An Early Resurrection. He also directs the Latter-day Saint Theology Seminar. Adam's wife, to whom he has been married for 22 years, is also a professor of biology, and I understand their offices, I don't know how they arranged this, but are very near one another, even across the hall. They are parents to 3 children, one of whom is in college, 2 of whom are in high school. Adam is originally from Pennsylvania, trained at Provo and Villanova, as I shared. But Adam and his family have been in Texas since 2005, so going on 15 years. Outside of family and work, Adam enjoys basketball, running, and at least in the before COVID times, going to the movies, and I think is a bit of a motion picture aficionado, I gather. I do look forward to the discussion this evening, and I invite each of you to participate respectfully in the dialogue and the discussion via the chat feature as I just described. If you have a question for Adam, please click on that plus sign and use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote. If you see another question that you really like or are interested in, you can click on that, and that will kind of move that up closer to the top of the queue for the moderator's attention. So if those have not been asked, please do that if you see other questions you're interested in. We will do our best to get to many of these questions. I doubt we will get to all of them. And we'll do that kind of in the latter half of this evening's session. As a note for everyone, this session will be recorded and will be available later this week on the Widtsoe Foundation's YouTube channel. So you will be able to revisit it there. So Adam, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's great to be with you. To kind of get things started, I would love to just ask you a little bit about this work and how you approached it. Let me start by just reading briefly, and I realize those on the call or those on the seminar have not yet seen the copy. I was able to peruse an advanced copy, which I very much enjoyed. But Adam, you open the book saying that Mormon is a terrifying book. You write that Mormon, loses everything and everyone he loves. His world collapses around him socially, politically, economically, ecologically, religiously. He's forced to watch as his people's cities are destroyed, as their lands are burned, as their women and children are sacrificed to idols, and as hundreds of thousands of corpses pile up. Mormon, with his eyes wide open, quote, sees all life and stuff about him involved in a huge, ceaseless combustion, a literal and apparent process of oxidation which is turning some things slowly, some rapidly, but all things surely to ashes, close quote. And that's a Hugh Nibley reference that Adam shares. So Adam, I'd be curious, can you tell us how you approached this and how you thought about what we have to learn from Mormon, and how this notion of it being terrifying and this man who loses everything, what that means for us as we think about our own lives and our own times and our own sense of discipleship.
Yeah. Thanks for reading that, George, and thanks for hosting us tonight. Thanks to the Widtsoe Foundation for putting this on, and the Maxwell Institute as well, for sponsoring this whole series of books on the books in the Book of Mormon, which I think are going to be a groundbreaking series of books. At a certain point, I think Latter-day Saint studies can't just be about history. At a certain point, as we reflect on our own religion and our own tradition, we have to start asking genuinely theological questions. We have to start asking about God, and not just in the past tense, but in the present tense. And so for me, thinking about Mormon, the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Mormon, which turns out to be surprisingly hard to explain to people, this was an occasion for me to investigate what it means right here and now to be a Christian disciple. So I took Mormon as a kind of case study in apocalyptic discipleship. Right? I treated Mormon's own little book as a kind of beginner's guide to the end of the world. And I wanted to ask a particular question. I wanted to ask, what does it look like to not just live in the expectation of the end of the world, but what does it look like instead to find yourself living through the end of the world the way that Mormon does? Now, when I initially asked this question 18 months ago, that felt like a little less on the nose, maybe, than it does right now to ask about living through the end of the world. But even 18 months ago, it felt like to me, I had a kind of gut instinct that we could see in Mormon something that was common to Christian discipleship across the board, that we could see him model for us in his apocalyptic discipleship, something about what we all go through as we experience our own world, hopefully in much less violent and dramatic ways, but we experience our own worlds constantly passing away before our own eyes. So for me, I think I figure Christian discipleship here as is modeled by Mormon as taking place at the crossroads between two different things. One, a certain kind of world, and two, a certain kind of religion. And the kind of world that Christian discipleship takes place in is a world in which all things are passing away, and we will lose all things, either slowly or quickly, but either way, as he nimbly put it, surely. Everything, Joseph Smith said, everything that has a beginning has an end. And I think that if we pay attention, we can feel that even on a very straightforward, week by week, day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute kind of way. We can feel our own lives passing away before us. We can feel them slipping through our fingers as the world that we were given is constantly turned over into the world that God is creating and giving here and now instead. I mean, if you think about, for instance, George, what it was like when you were growing up. Where did you grow up? Are you from Seattle originally?
No, I grew up in Salt Lake City.
I've heard of Salt Lake City.
It's a small city in northern Utah.
Yeah, nice. I got to go there someday. I imagine it was pretty different back then when you were growing up than the city is today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Well, I was going to ask you to expand on that, because one thing I found very poignant in your description in the book of this notion of all things passing away. I, like you, have 3 children. Mine are a little bit younger, and we recently, when they were small, we lived very near the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle, which is this beautiful zoo in this urban park right in Seattle. And when they were young, we would go there all the time. We were members of the zoo, and we'd take our little toddlers, and you might get an hour, you might get 2. And we actually recently took our 3 children, who are now 17, 14, 11. And we had a blast. But it was this, for my wife and myself, it was this very poignant walk in some ways down memory lane of seeing these places. And I hadn't admittedly been to the zoo in years, and we certainly hadn't been as a family together in years. But you expound on that a little more. You talk about how the changes we all witness are actually a very real and necessary part of life, and that the point of the gospel and even the point of the resurrection is not to kind of restore things to this frozen permanent state, but really to enable the continuation of all things as well.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I see Mormon as a template for Christian discipleship in general, is because the problem here that he's dealing with in a really dramatic way in terms of the end of his world is a problem that we're all dealing with right now in mortality. But it also seems to me that the problem, insofar as the problem is just time itself, is a problem that we will have to deal with for all of eternity. I mean, we as Mormons don't imagine the kind of eternity in which things come to a stop in the next world. We imagine an eternity in which God continues to create forever and ever, and that we continue to participate in that creation forever and ever. And that eternity, then, eternal life, is something like the promise that the world can continue to pass away rather than just stopping to pass away. And so Christian discipleship, I think, as it's modeled here by Mormon, is something like learning how, both for this world and for the worlds to come, learning how to respond in a godlike way to the world's perpetual passing. Which is to say, learning how to respond in a godlike way to the necessity of the world's continual recreation. And that brings me to the second point, right? If this is the kind of world that we live in, a certain kind of world that is constantly passing away, the other road that Christian discipleship sits at the crossroads of, the other road is the necessity of practicing a certain sort of religion, in which we are required as Christians to practice the sacrifice of all things. Right? This is a famous and terrifying line from the Lectures on Faith, where we're told that any religion that does not require the sacrifice of all things has not the power to produce the faith necessary unto life and salvation. And I don't think that's a hypothetical. I don't think that's just for pioneers. I think there's something about the very nature of the world, insofar as it's continually passing away, that we have to learn to handle it in this certain way, where we learn to sacrifice all things, to consecrate all things, to instead of clenching our fists and trying to hang on to what we have, we learn how to open our hands and give back to God again and again everything that He's given to us, positioning ourselves not as owners of anything, but as stewards, acting on His behalf to care for these things that we can always love, but that we can never keep.
All right. So what does Mormon then, as an individual, as a man, certainly also as a historian and compiler of records and an editor, what can we learn from him about this notion of, as you described, apocalyptic discipleship, of the necessity of really in some ways doing what Christ, and you allude to this as well, in the New Testament, asks of the rich man to sell everything he has, to give it all up and to come follow me. So what does Mormon have to teach us about, if our world comes down around us in ways small and large all the time, and if we are of necessity, as you argue, that we need to necessarily sacrifice those things as part of our discipleship. What do we learn from Mormon about that, and what's significant about his serving as a witness to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. The example of the rich young man from the New Testament is a nice example, right? It's not a question of whether or not the rich young man is going to lose everything that he has. He is going to lose everything that he has. Right. The question is just how he is going to lose it. Yeah, is he going to lose it kicking and screaming, or is he going to lose it by willingly sacrificing it in a gesture of love and trust? Christian discipleship is that hard work of willingly losing all things by way of sacrifice and consecration. so that we're in a position to care for these things as they pass away. I think one of the things that's really striking about Mormon, maybe the most obvious feature of his discipleship, both across the Book of Mormon and in his own book, is that Christian discipleship in lots of ways for Mormon boils down to the hard work of witnessing. He is a witness, and not just a witness of Christ, but a witness of the world in relationship to Christ. The very first thing we're told about Mormon in the opening pages of Mormon is that when Ammoron comes to give him the records, to commission him as a kind of official witness, Ammoron says that he's giving him these records because he sees that Mormon is sober and quick to observe. Mm-hmm. Right? And then in a couple of verses later, when Mormon describes to us, when he tries to explain why he was visited by Jesus Christ, Mormon says the only explanation he can give is because he was of a sober mind, even at a very young age. And I think that goes hand in hand, that kind of sobriety, that kind of capacity for observation, his attentiveness, his willing to see what's happening in front of his own eyes, to witness it. That's at the heart of his own practice of discipleship. Rather than running away from the end of the world, Mormon is willing to trust God enough to be in this world, to care for it, to love it, even as he loses it, to witness it, even if it's not going to turn out the way that he wants. And this really sets him apart, I think, from the other Nephites, as Mormon tells the story, who I think are characterized by the fact that they're not willing to look in the eye the fact that their world is passing away. Their experience is characterized by what Mormon calls not a sorrowing unto repentance, like he does, but a kind of sorrowing of the damned, in which they try to hang on to their treasures, in which they try to build up churches unto themselves to get gain, in which they try to treat religion as a mechanism for sacrificing a few things in order to avoid the sacrifice of all things. They're not willing to witness. They're not willing to see the writing on the wall the way that Mormon is. And as a result, they end up losing everything. What sets Mormon apart, I think, as a Christian, is the fact that he's willing to look the truth of this world in the eye and love it anyway.
It's interesting. I mean, and you in the volume you touch on this, and others will have a chance to look at that as well. But you mentioned, I'm trying to remember the term you used. I think it was a divine melancholy.
Yeah.
And I, admittedly, I tend to be I'm an optimist, and I tend to be a joyful Christian. There's much to be joyful about, but expand a little bit on that notion of divine melancholy and why that facing it in the eye and really looking at the world as it is important for Mormon and perhaps then by extension for us. And I'd also be curious for your thoughts. You argue that this witnessing is a central facet of Mormon's discipleship. And I would ask, what alternative did he have? Could he have done anything else other than witness it, if that makes sense?
Let's do your last question first. I think he could have done what his own people did. I think he could have put his head in the sand and pretended that the world wasn't ending. I think he could have lost himself in distractions and anger and plots for revenge and recovery of things that he'd lost, instead of taking up the hard work of actual discipleship. I think the Mormon's sobriety, his kind of sensitivity to the way that the world is passing away, this kind of melancholic disposition of his, is a really powerful dimension of his Christian discipleship, because we're told right up front that our fundamental obligations as Christians upon baptism, our fundamental obligations include the short list of things like mourning with those that mourn and comforting those that stand in need of comfort. And then additionally, standing as witnesses, not only of Christ, but of his ability to meet those problems. And if I'm not, as a disciple of Christ, tuned in to the suffering around me, if I'm not tuned into the world, the way the world is passing away, and the way that the mourning is a perpetual feature of the world, then I will never be in a position to respond with love and charity and care the way that my own covenant partnership with God requires me to. So that there's a sense in which a deep sensitivity to the problems around us is the very thing, number one, that enables us to respond to those problems in God's name, on God's behalf. And it's also the kind of thing I think that puts us in a position to be sensitive to have a capacity for gratitude and appreciation and joy for what we have as it's passing through our hands. If I'm not sensitive to the fact that my 15-year-old is only going to be 15 years old for this 365 days, then I'm not going to appreciate it. I'm not going to be grateful for it. I'm not going to take joy in it, right? It will slip by as I try to pretend that the world is not passing away. And I won't be in a position to love him or take joy in him if I don't have that kind of baseline sensitivity to the troubles of the world.
Yeah. What, Adam, what about this notion that Mormon also, and I think the words he uses, he loves without hope, and to this observation of we love our 15-year-olds and enjoy them for the moments that they have and are now, realizing that when they are 25 and 35 and 45-year-olds, they'll be different, and our relationship with them will be different, but we will still love them also differently, probably. But I'd just be curious, how do you sort of think about Mormon's willingness to continue to love, even though he doesn't have that hope that actually he's going to get to know his people 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, because he knows they're going the other direction?
Yeah, Mormon uses a handful of really interesting, provocative phrases over the course of his little book that all start with the word without. For instance, when he's trying to describe what it looks like to be the damned, to feel the sorrowing of the damned, he describes his people as attempting to live in the world without God, right? They're attempting to live without God. They're attempting to live in a world without a creator, in a sense. They're attempting to live in a world that isn't continually being recreated. They're refusing to participate in God's ongoing work of creation. But he also uses, I think, even more unusually, two phrases, two little descriptions that probably ought to rub us the wrong way, at least on first reading, in which he describes his own discipleship on one occasion as being without hope, and on another occasion as being without faith. But he gives both those descriptions in the context of a kind of positive assessment of his own discipleship. In the one case, he goes back to command again the Nephite armies after having refused to be part of their bid for revenge. He eventually comes back to help them defend themselves and takes command of the armies again. And he says that he does this, he's sacrificing himself for them, even though he does it without hope. And he also describes in an earlier passage how he poured out his heart and mind and soul in prayer and love for his people, even though that prayer was without faith. Now, those are unusual descriptions, self-descriptions for a disciple to describe himself as without hope or without faith. But I think what he's getting at there is he's trying to describe what's involved in the business of sacrificing all things. And part of what's involved in the business of sacrificing all things is that Mormon finds himself in a position where he's willing to do the right thing, even if he doesn't think it's going to get him the outcome that he hopes for. The Nephites aren't going to repent. He's not going to be able to save them. He doesn't have any faith or hope that he'll get the outcome that he's looking for, but he still sacrifices himself for them. He still loves them. He still turns over his heart and mind and soul to the business of caring for them. And I think that's an important element of what happens when we practice sacrifice, is that we cut the cord between our actions, our investment in our actions, and the outcomes that we hope for. and we give all of our time and attention and care to the action itself and leave the outcomes up to God. We're without any hope of getting the reward that we want, right? We let go any hope of getting the reward that we wanted, and we just love anyway. And that's a pretty good description of sacrifice, even though it's unusual, I think, on Mormon's part.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That was another thought I had in reading your volume, and also thinking about Mormon, is whether that hopelessness is necessarily something that is coincident with discipleship. And I like how you've described that no, not necessarily, that loving without hope is important regardless.
Yeah, if we come back for just a second, if we come back to something like, you come back to your 15-year-old, if you think to yourself, if I can get my 15-year-old to turn out the way that I want, then I'll love him, right? If I'm loving him because I have a hope that he will be a certain way,
right?
That's not love, right? Love looks like my loving him regardless of whether things are going to turn out the way that I want. So I have to kind of let go of my hope for the outcome that I was looking for, and just care.
Well, and that's, I think, one of the most powerful lessons of Mormon. And I want to go back to this notion. Mormon, of course, is compiling and editing and curating this much larger record, in addition to his own discrete portions of that record throughout the volume that he's compiling. You write, this is the essential thing to know about the text of Mormon itself. Mormon not only lived as a witness, he shaped his book to function as a witness. Both his life and his discipleship are defined by the work of witnessing. He witnesses the world's passing away. He witnesses violence and loss. He witnesses suffering and death. And through it all, he never stops witnessing that nonetheless, Christ hath gained the victory over the grave, and in him is the sting of death swallowed up. That's from Mormon chapter 7, verse 5. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what role does this notion of witnessing and watching his world literally fall down around him. How do you think that plays into Mormon's role as editor writ large, as he's compiling this book, not just his own writings, but kind of choosing and selecting the other pieces to put in this larger book? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it plays a significant part, both in the way he shapes the Book of Mormon and in how he understands himself as a disciple in the work of shaping the Book of Mormon. I think if we take his own little book, perhaps as the best case study in how this works for Mormon, it's easy to see the way that he structures his book as a witness, not just a kind of history, but as a kind of directly addressed witness of Christ to future readers. The little Book of Mormon in the Book of Mormon was Joseph Smith dictated it. It didn't have 9 chapters, but had 4 chapters. And I think when you pay attention to where those original chapter breaks fall, the structure of Mormon's own book becomes much clearer. The first 3 of those chapters, of those original chapters, were the ones written by Mormon himself before you get to the final chapter, 2 chapters in our version, 8 and 9, that were then tacked on by Moroni. Mormon's own 3 chapters all have the exact same structure. He spends half the chapter giving you history, getting you up to speed on what was going on, and then he breaks from this kind of third-person historical reporting to spend the rest of each chapter directly addressing future readers, future Israelite readers, future Gentile readers, future Lamanite readers, directly addressing them and witnessing to them about the significance of the things that he was just describing historically, and explaining what it has to do with them and how they need to respond then in light of what he's told them. And I think it's especially that kind of, like those moments when he, at great length in his own book, not just occasionally like he does in the rest of the Book of Mormon, but at great length in his own book, when he breaks the 4th wall and directly addresses us as if we were present, that he's most clearly and dramatically in the structure of the book functioning as a witness.
Yeah. I want to get to some questions from the audience shortly, but will you share some of you also write throughout about this notion of recreation and how, as a complement to the necessary or the realistic falling and failing of all things. It also, it makes me think of, Moroni's recording of his father Mormon's talk in Moroni 7 about faith, hope, and charity, and talking about how all things must fail, using this same language that Paul uses. It's interesting to think about Mormon very literally feeling all those things falling and failing around him. But you then talk a lot about also recreation and this recreative or regenerative process that's also important. Will you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah. Just to comment first on that line from Moroni / Paul,
right,
about how all things will fail.
All things must fail.
Except for one thing. Charity is the only thing that doesn't fail. Charity, the very business of responding to the failure of all things by way of sacrificing all things, is the only thing that never fails. It's the only thing that's never going to come to an end, is the necessity for us to respond to the failure of everything else with charity, with care, with attention, with this kind of abiding love, regardless of whether or not we get what we want and things turn out the way that we wanted them to, or we get to keep the things that we wanted to keep. I think it's really important to see, as you pointed out, that the flip side of the loss of all things is the creation of all things. The reason that the world is continually passing away right before our eyes, moment by moment, second by second, is that the world is continually being created again, moment by moment, second by second, cell by cell in my own body, as the whole thing gets replaced, day by day, week by week, year by year, right? The whole world continually recreated. Part of what we're refusing when we refuse to witness the loss of all things, part of what we're refusing is we're refusing to participate in God's recreation of all things. And this gets pointed out repeatedly in the course of Mormon's own text here, that what people are refusing is they're refusing God as the creator, and they're refusing God as the ongoing creator, as a God who does not cease to create, as a God who does not cease to do miracles, as a God who does not cease to intervene and be active. Right? We would in general, as sinners, much prefer a God who was at a great distance and who was done doing whatever he was going to do, and things could settle down and we could keep what we wanted to keep. But that's not the nature of the world, and that's certainly not the nature of the work that God is doing. So part of what's needed from me as a Christian disciple, in order to align my will with God's, is that I have to align my will with his desire to continue creating. And I participate in that work of creation willingly by sacrificing what he's already given me and receiving with joy and gratitude whatever is coming next.
Yeah. And I think there's a nice tie there as well that you make also, that's also part of what the repentance process is. That is, we are becoming new creatures ourselves, and that also is a recreative or a regenerative process in many ways.
Yeah, it's that particular kind of mourning. It's that sorrowing unto repentance, right? That's sensitized to the world in a way that can sacrifice and thus love what's being lost.
Yeah. Before we go to some audience questions, and we've got a handful here that I want to look at. What was new or perhaps enlightening or surprising to you as you put together this volume, as you really dived into Mormon and thought about this? What new insights, ideas, kind of aha moments were there for you as a scholar, or for you very personally? Anything you're willing to share?
Yeah, there was one thing in particular that struck me when it came to the kind of practical business of, on a day-by-day basis, living as a Christian disciple. And it had to do with the way that one of the most striking features of Mormons people, of the Nephites, is their desire for revenge, hand in hand with their refusal to let the world pass away. was their desire to get back what they lost and to get revenge on the world for not being what they wanted, for not remaining the way that they wanted it to remain. So by this kind of wicked cocktail of fear and anger and a desire for revenge. Whereas Mormon, on the other hand, as a Christian disciple, that discipleship unfolds as the business of giving up on the project of revenge. And I think in a really straightforward way, the practice of sacrificing all things on a daily basis, on an ordinary hour by hour, minute by minute basis, the business of sacrificing all things looks like the business of forgiving all things. It looks like the business of my continually forgiving the world for passing away. It looks like my continually forgiving myself, my wife, my children, my job, my house, my car, everything all around me, right? The world engaged in this huge, ceaseless process of combustion, forgiving all of that passing away as it unfolds. That's what it looks like, I think, to sacrifice, is to constantly engage in this business of forgiveness. And if I think about Christian discipleship in that way, then I think I end up flipping on its head the way that we normally think about what Christian discipleship is about. I think it's really common for us to think that practicing my religion is about getting God to forgive me for all the things that I've done wrong. And if I can get God to forgive me, then I've succeeded at my religion. Mm. But I think as a practical matter, we'd be a lot better off thinking about it the other way around, that the practice of my religion isn't about getting God to forgive me, that the practice of my religion is instead about my willingness to forgive all things.
Yeah, well, and one note, and maybe we can come back to this, I really appreciated you expound a little bit in the volume about your own view of theology and what theology means. And my very brief and probably not completely, it won't be a completely satisfactory summary of that, is that theology is only helpful in to the extent that it actually helps us to act and to behave and to do and to engage with the divine and with God. That it's not just history and it's not just dogma and it's not just doctrine. It's how does it actually make us live our lives in a different way. And I really appreciate that physical, that Christo-physical aspect you bring to this volume in particular. Let me ask a question here that's been posed, looks like by Jordan. We in the church, of course, have an eternal view, and we respect and reverence those things that have an eternal and usually sort of long-term horizon. I realize that eternity is not just temporality, but meaning it of the divine. But if as Mormon and you suggest, all things will eventually pass away, how do you suggest we think about some of our eternal themed promises and some of the things we think about as permanent, like the new and everlasting covenant of marriage or other covenants and ordinances and blessings in which we participate, about which we tend to think very, very long term?
Yeah, I would suggest, number one, what do I know about the nature of eternity? So let's put that up front. I'm a community college professor in Texas. But insofar as I propose an answer, I would propose the answer precisely in terms of 1 Corinthians 13, in terms of though all things will fail, there's one thing that won't, and it's charity. There's one thing that endures. It's this kind of sensitized care. And I would recommend that we think about the gospel covenant itself, both in terms of our sealings to our spouses and our family members and to God and the covenant relationships that we enter into, as the very forms that structure that charity that will endure. They're the forms, they're not the charity, they're not the care itself. But I think that insofar as those things endure, they endure because of the fact that they're grounded in the one thing that doesn't pass away. And that's charity. That's the pure love of Christ.
Right. Talk, if you will, share some thoughts on Mormon's cognitive dissonance. He's a warrior seeing piles of corpses, but he's also compiling a record to fulfill and to, talk to really us, as you talk about. He's breaking that fourth wall often and speaking to us who will read this later, to fulfill God's promises. I mean, he obviously is worried and reticent about his own people, but he also is writing these very hopeful, promising, long-term thoughts. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts there about Mormon as an individual and how he must have tried to juggle those differing pieces.
Yeah. Number one, I can't imagine what a nightmare it would have been to live the life that he lived. Just blood-soaked chaos by his own description from beginning to end. Just a literal nightmare from which he could never awake. I can't imagine what that would be like. I think Tell me again the second part of the question.
Well, just this cognitive dissonance that he faces, seeing everything coming crashing down, loving his people without hope, but preparing this volume of to speak to us in our time. That actually, guess what? There is a lot of reason to be hopeful, and there, and Moroni, I think himself later on says similar sorts of things that we ought to. Sorry, I'm just looking here. That God will continue His miracles, and that these signs will continue, and there's many things still to come.
Yeah. I think for.
Sorry, Adam, I'll throw at you. Someone else put this in. His last written words in Moroni 7:10 say, "It shall be well." So how do we what do we have to learn there from, and how does he manage that cognitive dissonance, which certainly we all probably face to some degree?
Yeah, I think in a really down-to-earth way, it's the very mechanics of writing that are a kind of lifeline for Mormon. It's the very act of writing the act of writing allows him to step beyond the bounds of his own time and place, to live outside of time and connect with eternity by writing these things that can reach back thousands of years into the past and reach forward thousands of years into the future, and see things in this larger context, to see the way that in light of God's promise, the arc of history will bend towards justice and recreation and charity, despite all of the losses in the meanwhile. I think the very business of writing there is how he enacts his connection with eternity, and allows him to not just be trapped inside of his own tiny nightmarish moment in history. And so I think that the very business of record keeping there is very powerful for him.
Another question that I realize not directly related to what you've written about, but it's an interesting question. The sharer asks, what thoughts do you have, if any, about Mormon's inclusion of the so-called war chapters throughout Alma? Given his Mormon's own time, do you think he saw that era as something very familiar, and you think that's perhaps part of the reason that got occupied so much plate space, if you will?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, the most striking difference between the kind of account that we get in the war chapters in Alma and the kind of accounts that we get in Mormon itself, the most striking differences have to do with scale and with granularity. Right, we get a very detailed, very blow by blow, battle by battle, sometimes sword stroke by sword stroke account of what's happening in those war chapters in Alma. But by the time we get to Mormon's own experience, we don't ever get anything like that. Instead, we get sweeping descriptions of horrors that unfold over the span of 5-6 years at a time, and over the course of just 1 or 2 verses. And we never see anything with the same level of granularity as we do in those war chapters. I'm not sure what that difference means, or why he went about things one way in the first case and second case, and a different way in the second case. But I'd be interested to see what people thought.
I appreciated I think this was in your chapter 6. You talked a little bit about sin being the business of living in denial, and as you've alluded to earlier, I think a real struggle of mortality in the human experience is to not be preoccupied with the temporary things around us, the treasure, as Mormon refers to. But I'd welcome any thoughts or reflections you have on how do we as disciples actually, how do we distance ourselves from that living in denial, that state of sin, and similarly, how do we put those temporal things in their right perspective in terms of our relationships with them?
Yeah.
And what Mormon, can teach us about that is the real question, I guess.
I mean, it's my own description, but I do think it's a helpful description to think about sin.
Yeah, no, I really like it
as the business of living in denial. I think it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see the way that, especially here in the 21st century, first world America, that our entire lives are built around an infrastructure that comforts and buffers us and makes it possible for me to not come in contact with suffering, that maximizes my capacity to be comfortable at all times, to the point where if I find myself slightly bored, I do not even have to suffer a minute's worth of boredom in a line at the grocery store. I can pull out my phone and flee into a kind of comforting distraction. We're sinners. We build our lives from top to bottom to buffer ourselves from the passing away of the world, from the suffering that the world is filled with. And in the process, we end up cutting ourselves off from the very stuff of life itself. We end up dead. We end up losing our connection to the world around us. We end up losing a kind of vibrant, plugged-in, connected sense for the world as it spins through its seasons, as our children and ourselves pass through our different stages of life, through the different ages. And our lives end up going on without us as we avoid living them because they're difficult, because they're troubling, because they're painful, because they're passing away. The business of not being in denial is the business of not running away from suffering, is the business of doing exactly what Jesus did, of planting his feet and turning around and looking suffering in the eye, and in the process of looking it in the eye, of transforming it, of saving it, of redeeming it, of ameliorating it. It doesn't look any different from doing what he did, though if I look at what my own life looks like on a daily basis, it doesn't look a whole lot like how he spent his time.
Thank you. Well said. And I think you, of course, make that point about Mormon too, that he is willing to look these horrible circumstances in the eye and not back down, but to do what needs to be done, even in the face of just overwhelming difficulty. As a reminder, I know we just have a few minutes left, but if you've joined a little bit late, if you have questions, you can, in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, there's an option to, if you click the plus sign, you'll see an opportunity to ask questions. Another question from the attendees, Adam. Any thoughts on perhaps unique or unusual aspects to our viewpoint of creation as Latter-day Saints, how we think about creation, and how that might differ from, well, the question here says, what makes the Mormon view of creation after creation lead to a desire of going on with it instead of seeking to get off the endless merry-go-round of karma? I'm curious, thoughts there on how our particular Latter-day Saint theology and beliefs may influence how we think about this process of recreation, and how that may differ from friends of other faiths.
For sure, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for one thing, we don't have a Mormon point of view anymore. That has itself passed away. We only have a Latter-day Saint point of view. That's us now. But when it comes to a Latter-day Saint point of view, I think there is a striking difference between how we, for instance, and the rest of traditional Christianity thinks about the nature of creation. And Joseph Smith hit this on the head right away, right out of the gate, is that traditionally Christians believe in creation ex nihilo. The tradition believes that God created the world out of nothing. And because there was a time before the world was created, there can be a time after the world is done being created. You can escape time back into eternity, into a kind of frozen perfection, I think, in the traditional telling of the story. But we as Latter-day Saints have explicitly rejected the idea of creation ex nihilo. We believe that we were there in some sense with God in the beginning, that we in some sense were not even created by God, that we are eternal intelligences after some fashion, and that when God goes about creating, he doesn't create things out of nothing. He goes about reorganizing the material that is already there, such that every act of creation is always an act of recreation, which is part and parcel of why every act of creation is also the business of losing what happened or what was the case before. The world has to continually pass away because the world is continually recreated, because the world wasn't created out of nothing. All creation is recreation, and there's no plan B. There's no exit hatch. There's no place else to go. This is the nature of the universe. And to pattern our lives after God is to follow the pattern that he uses to deal with the fact that the world is continually passing away, continually in need of recreation, and that looks like sacrifice.
But are you willing to share, Adam, any thoughts on what role that line of thinking had in your approach to this volume? You kind of comment in the afterword how, as you have come to, better understand, and I realize you're not a climate scientist per se, but as you have kind of become more keenly aware of the huge threats posed to us as humankind by the ongoing crisis regarding the climate, that in a very real sense we are seeing things much bigger than ourselves falling apart around us. I'm curious what role maybe that played in your thinking about Mormon's viewpoint, also witnessing a world collapsing around him, which he was powerless, or perhaps felt powerless to do anything about, and by extension, where we can look for some hope or some opportunities, instead of living in denial. How do we repent and maybe do some of the hard work that needs to be done to make the world around us a better place, both in micro and macro levels?
Yeah, when Spencer Fluman originally approached me about participating in the brief theological introductions to the Book of Mormon series, I said that I would do it if I could write about Mormon, because I wanted to write about the end of the world. I wanted a chance to think about what it looks like as a Christian disciple to live through the end of the world, and to see what that cast into sharp relief with respect to the nature of Christian discipleship in general, such that it could reshape maybe how I approach discipleship just on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour basis. But also because you don't have to be a climate scientist here to see that all of the science is pointing in the same direction with respect to the kinds of climate-related catastrophes that we will face in the next 100, 200 years, that will go off like a slowly exploding bomb through the rest of our lives, through the lives of our children, and maybe especially our children and our grandchildren. The world that they inherit will be radically, dramatically different than ours, and likely not in positive, better, substantially improved ways. So I wanted to think about, what does Christian discipleship look like? What should I, as a Christian disciple, do in the face of the end of the world, both at a personal level and at the level of our claim as Latter-day Saints that these, in fact, are the latter days, and that the Book of Mormon was a book specially intended for us, perhaps as a kind of beginner's guide to the end of the world, to help us think about what to do and how to deal with the world as it ends around us, both in ordinary ways and really, really global, dramatic ways. And at the end of the day, it's no surprise, I don't think, that whether the problems that we're dealing with are small and ordinary household type problems, or whether that they are problems on a global scale. The only meaningful response for us to give is to step up to the plate and sacrifice all things. There is no hope for us on a personal scale or a global scale in anything but Christ. There is no hope for us in anything but the work of sacrifice and complete consecration.
Thank you. And that, as I said earlier, I think was one of the things I found so compellingly personal about this volume. I mean, you remind the reader at the beginning that, one's faith and my faith, and I would argue our faith collectively, really does ask of that, that complete and utter willingness and consecration to give it all for something greater than oneself. I want to give you the last word. I did want to just share, and I'm not going to make you answer this question, but I think it's a really beautiful kind of question with which you leave the reader toward the end of the volume. You say, to this end, you're describing kind of this is in the conclusion, I proposed to read Mormon's book as a beginner's guide to the end of the world. I proposed to read Mormon as a case study in apocalyptic discipleship. And my reading was shaped throughout by a wager that the extremity of Mormon's apocalyptic discipleship could bring more clearly into view the fact that living through the end of the world on any number of scales, whether that's the climate as we've discussed, or whether that's mourning the passing of your child from infancy to toddlerhood to adolescence to adulthood to losing a loved one, whatever that end of the world might look like for you or for an individual, that is the fundamental framework for Christian discipleship of any kind by anyone in any world in any age. If this is true, and Mormon's life can be read as an exemplary case of discipleship, still quoting Adam here, then what aspects of discipleship have now been thrown into sharp relief? If tomorrow I want to begin again, live as a disciple of Christ, and learn how to willingly participate in the recreation of the world, what should I do? What does this work look like? What can we conclude? And I won't make you answer that, Adam, but I think it's a really important question that each of us must ask ourselves. If in fact these are some of the lessons to take from Mormon, what does it mean for us when we wake up tomorrow? How do we continue apace and continue to do the things that each of us needs to do? Really briefly, Adam, any just closing thoughts or observations before we conclude?
And that was great. I think you hit the nail on the head. I appreciate you. Thanks for reading that.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I really encourage everyone, as soon as you get a chance to get your hands on this, it's a really compelling read. I really enjoyed it. Adam, it has been a real pleasure to spend an hour with you this evening and just kind of looking through the comments and some of the questions that we didn't have time to get to. I know people really appreciate your thinking and your sharing and your pushing us to think as well. I do just want to conclude by thanking everyone for joining us this evening, for your participation and your questions. As a reminder, the recording of this session will be available on the Widtsoe Foundation's YouTube channel a little bit later this week. And as a note, if you enjoyed this evening's discussion, next week we'll have the next installment in the Book of Mormon Conversation series. That's next Sunday, November 22nd, again, 5 o'clock Pacific time. And that'll be with Rosalind Welch, the author of the series volume on Ether, and will be moderated by my colleague Michael Stanley, who another board member from the Widtsoe Foundation. So again, that's next Sunday, the 22nd at 5 p.m. with Rosalind Welch and Michael Stanley. Adam Miller, thank you so much for doing this with us this evening. Big thank you both to the Widtsoe Foundation and the Maxwell Institute for making these possible. And thank you all for spending an hour of your Sunday evening with us.
Thanks, George.
Have a good night.